You are a young girl, barely 12, torn from your village at night, your cries swallowed by the silence of soldiers. One moment you lie beside your family. The next, you are dragged away, your wrists bound, your voice choked into silence. This scene was repeated across continents. From the Balkans to the Caucasus, from Africa to Eastern Europe, countless girls were captured in raids, sold in markets, or handed over by decree. For some, the violence was immediate. Ottoman raiding parties swept through villages, earning homes, cutting down men, and seizing women and children. Survivors were marched away in chains, their futures erased in a single night. For others, the abduction was official. In certain provinces, entire communities were forced to provide tribute children to the empire. Girls delivered in quotas like livestock to meet imperial demand. Archival tax registers record these levies in cold bureaucratic handwriting. A dozen girls from one district, 24 from another. To the empire, they were not children, they were resources. The bureaucracy of human trafficking left its mark in ledgers and decrees. Girls were classified by age, beauty, race, and strength. A Circassian child, pale-skinned and light-eyed, was listed as premium. An African child, deemed suitable for heavy domestic labor, carried a lower price. Ottoman administrators turned humanity into categories, reducing lives to trade codes and market value. For the girls themselves, the first act of slavery was erasure. You who once had a name, a faith, and a family were stripped of all three. European observers described the process with chilling detachment. Names were discarded. Christian crosses were torn from necks. Baptismal identities vanished as girls were forced into conversion ceremonies, baptized anew in the empire's language and religion. Records from 17th century Istanbul describe how children, unable to speak Turkish or Arabic, were given new names at the moment of sale, an act that severed them forever from the lives they had once known. Eyewitnesses left haunting testimonies. The traveler Evliya Çelebi recorded caravans of child captives trudging toward Istanbul, their tears falling like rain, yet their voices silenced by the lash. Venetian envoys wrote of markets crowded with children so young, they scarcely remember the mothers from whom they were torn. These words reveal a world where innocence itself was reduced to inventory. You are in that caravan. The road stretches for weeks. The guards strike at those who stumble. Around you, children cry themselves into silence, learning quickly that screams earn only pain. Historians estimate that across 4 centuries, hundreds of thousands of girls were swept into this system. Some were sold once, others resold many times. Each transfer deepened the loss, replacing what little identity remained with the cold certainty of ownership. Behind this vast system stood law and faith. Ottoman jurisprudence, grounded in Islamic rulings, defined non-Muslim captives as lawful spoils. Religious decrees legitimized their enslavement, presenting forced conversion as an act of mercy rather than theft. This legal framework gave the empire confidence, transforming mass abduction into a practice both profitable and pious. But the reality was terror and silence. Fragments of resistance appear in hidden writings. A Venetian merchant mourned the sight of children who, within a year, had forgotten their native tongue entirely. An African chronicler wrote bitterly of daughters unmade, their lives dissolved into shadows. These rare voices testify to a pain deliberately concealed by the empire's grandeur. For every girl taken, a household was destroyed. Mothers woke to empty beds. Fathers returned to ashes. Communities vanished, their children absorbed into the empire's machinery of exploitation. You are that girl. You are 12. Your name is gone. Your childhood is finished. And yet, this was only the beginning. But being captured was only the beginning. The real horror began inside the empire's walls. Imagine standing naked, inspected like livestock, as men haggle over your worth. your body is no longer yours. It is merchandise measured, prodded, and priced. This was the fate of countless women in the Ottoman slave markets. From Istanbul to Cairo, from Aleppo to Bursa, bazaars thrived on the trade of human beings. The greatest markets stood in Istanbul itself, where Ottoman administrators regulated the sale of girls with a cold precision that left no doubt. This was an empire where flesh was currency. The ritual of sale was degrading by design. Captives were stripped, displayed in rows, and ordered to walk before buyers. Men examined their limbs for strength, their skin for blemishes, their teeth for health. Virginity was a prized commodity, tested in humiliating ways that left deep psychological scars. European merchants, writing in horrified detail, described scenes where girls were handled, as one handles a beast, turned this way and that until their value was determined. Prices followed a brutal racial hierarchy. Archival sales registers reveal how Caucasian women, especially Circassians and Georgians, were placed at the top of the market. Pale skin, light eyes, and delicate features made them symbols of status, fetching prices far beyond their African or Anatolian counterparts. A young Circassian girl could sell for several times the value of an African woman of the same age. Ottoman buyers viewed these racial distinctions not merely as preference, but as economic calculation. Those of African descent were not exempt from demand, but they were usually condemned to harder labor. Records from Cairo list African women sold for kitchen service, field work, and heavy domestic duties. The hierarchy was explicit. One group celebrated as ornaments of luxury, another reduced to tools of labor. This was not random cruelty, but a system that assigned monetary value to human difference. And behind every sale stood the empire's bureaucracy. Treasury archives contain meticulous notes of the taxes levied on each transaction. Every purchase generated revenue for the state. Whether a girl was sold for 5 gold coins or 50, the Sultan's coffers took a share. The bureaucracy of enslavement turned bodies into streams of profit, embedding slavery not only in Ottoman households, but in the fiscal machinery of the empire itself. For the women on the block, the humiliation was total. You are forced to stand under the gaze of men who debate your worth aloud. One strokes his beard and points to the curve of your shoulders. Another scoffs, lowering your value because of a scar. The bidding rises and falls, as though you were no more than a bolt of silk or a sack of grain. Eyewitnesses confirm the cruelty. A Venetian trader wrote of a hall where girls stood trembling, their eyes red from tears, yet they were ordered to smile, for a sad face diminished their price. Another traveler recorded a chilling detail. Prospective buyers sometimes brought physicians to inspect the captives, ensuring their investment was healthy and fertile. The market's cruelty was masked by its normality. It was routine, regulated, taxed. Year after year, generation after generation, women passed through these bazaars, their identities erased and replaced by price tags. Historians estimate that thousands of female captives were sold annually in Istanbul alone, their sales fueling not just private households, but the very economy of empire. The markets were not marginal shadows. They were central institutions, legal, profitable, and visible to anyone who dared to look. You are no longer a girl. You are a transaction, a number in a ledger. But for some, the journey did not end here. For a select few, purchase by the wealthy meant a new destination. Their prison would not be a kitchen or a field, but a palace and environment gilded in luxury, yet no less a cage. Yet for those taken into palaces, the prison looked deceptively like paradise. Behind golden doors lay not luxury, but a prison of silence and fear. Silk curtains could not hide the chains. Marble floors could not erase the truth. The Ottoman imperial harem has long been shrouded in myth. European travelers painted it as a palace of endless pleasure, a fantasy of decadence and desire. But archival accounts, palace records, and eyewitness testimonies tell a different story. The harem was not paradise. It was confinement strictly regulated, ruthlessly controlled, and forever closed to the outside world. At its core, the harem was a system of order. Women were not gathered for leisure, but for power. Enslaved girls, once bought in markets or seized through tribute, were placed into a hierarchy so rigid it resembled a bureaucracy. At the lowest level were the odalisks, young attendants destined to serve silently. Above them stood favored concubines, chosen for beauty, obedience, or political value. And at the pinnacle, the valid sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, ruled with formidable authority, wielding influence over court politics and dynastic survival. Every movement within this hierarchy was controlled by palace eunuchs. These men, stripped of their own identities through castration, became gatekeepers of the women's lives. No word, no letter, no whisper passed without their knowledge. European envoys who glimpsed the system described an atmosphere of suffocating surveillance, where women lived under constant watch, denied even the memory of freedom. You are a girl who has entered the gilded halls. You are clothed in silk, fed delicacies, trained in music and refinement. To the outside world, it looks like fortune. Yet you are never allowed to leave. Your family will never see you again. Every gesture, every glance is monitored. Your future depends not on your will, but on the whims of a master you may never even meet. Foreign accounts often marveled at the opulence, the jeweled fountains, the mosaics, the gardens. But these same records reveal the psychological torment. A Venetian ambassador once wrote that the women live in splendor, yet it is a splendor worse than chains, for they breathe air perfumed but poisoned by despair. The paradox was sharp. Immense privilege on the outside, immense suffering within. Some women rose to positions of extraordinary influence. A favored concubine could bear a son who might one day become sultan. In those moments, her voice could shape politics, her presence sway alliances. Yet such power came at the cost of absolute isolation. For every woman elevated, countless others remained invisible decorations in an empire that never allowed them to decide their own fate. The gilded cage was also a fortress of silence. Letters to families were forbidden. Contact with the outside world was severed. Escape was unthinkable. Women died in those chambers, never again speaking the language of their childhood, never again setting foot in the villages from which they were stolen. And still, the empire presented the harem as a place of refinement, a symbol of imperial grandeur. The reality was far darker. Systematic psychological conditioning, turning human lives into instruments of dynasty and control. You may imagine the velvet cushions, the jeweled lamps, the hushed corridors. But within those walls, every luxury was laced with fear. The silence was not peace, it was suppression. The beauty was not freedom, it was a mask. The harem was both throne room and prison, both sanctuary and cage. It embodied the contradiction at the heart of the Ottoman system. Power built upon captivity, splendor erected upon suffering. But beyond palace walls, most enslaved women faced a far harsher fate. Your hands are raw, your back bent, yet the beatings never stop. Every day begins before dawn. Every night ends with exhaustion so deep it feels like death itself. For most enslaved women in the Ottoman Empire, life was not gilded palaces or whispered intrigues. It was kitchens, courtyards, and endless labor. The majority were placed in ordinary households, where their value was measured only by their usefulness, how much they could scrub, carry, or endure. They cooked the meals that others ate. They cleaned the floors that others dirtied. They fetched water across long distances, carrying heavy jars until their shoulders ached and their hands split. They raised children who were not their own, often forced to nurse infants while their own bodies bore scars of malnutrition. And through it all, there was no protection, no reprieve. The empire's legal framework reinforced their suffering. Ottoman law recognized the master's right to punish. Beatings were not considered crimes, but discipline, permitted and even expected as part of ownership. Archival rulings survive, where judges dismissed complaints of brutality, noting that punishment of slaves fell under the unquestioned authority of their masters. In effect, law legitimized violence as a daily tool of control. European travelers who passed through the empire recorded scenes that shocked even hardened observers. Some noted that slaves were struck with sticks, whipped, or forced to kneel for hours in punishment. Others described women forced to labor, even while ill, collapsing under loads of firewood or water, only to be roused with more blows. What horrified outsiders was accepted within Ottoman society as routine. You are that woman in the household. You sweep the floor, trembling under the gaze of your mistress. You wash clothes until your fingers bleed. A mistake, a broken dish, a spilled cup earns not correction but pain. A strike comes quickly, then another, and another, until your body is marked as clearly as your status. While rare exceptions existed, some masters treated slaves with relative kindness. These were anomalies. The overwhelming reality was relentless exploitation. An enslaved woman was not seen as a person but as property. Her exhaustion was invisible, her suffering normalized, her silence enforced. This invisibility compounded the cruelty. In palaces, the grandeur at least drew attention, generating fascination and foreign reports. But in ordinary homes, enslaved women endured without witness. Their pain was absorbed into the rhythm of domestic life, unseen and unrecorded except in scattered notes from outsiders. Psychological abuse was as constant as physical violence. A woman lived with the knowledge that she had no rights, no recourse, no escape. Her very survival depended on obedience. To resist meant harsher punishment. To speak meant silencing blows. Over time, the system stripped away not only freedom but identity, reducing human beings to shadows in the background of another family's life. Records from provincial towns show just how ordinary this system became. Sales contracts listed enslaved women alongside livestock and tools, their prices fluctuating based on age and health. The transactional language reinforced the idea that their suffering was irrelevant, only their capacity to labor mattered. And still, they endured, year after year, task after task, punishment after punishment. Entire lives spent in service, erased from history except as numbers in tax registers or as anonymous figures in household accounts. This was the daily reality of Ottoman slavery, not the gilded cage of the palace, not the spectacle of the markets, but the quiet, relentless grind of invisible suffering. And for many, the deepest wounds were not on the hands, but on the body itself. Consent did not exist. You were property, and your body was their right. That truth governed every chamber, every bed, every whispered command. At the core of female slavery in the Ottoman Empire lay sexual exploitation. It was not an aberration. It was the system itself. Women were purchased not only for labor, but for flesh. They could be summoned at will, traded as gifts, or offered as political rewards to bind alliances. Concubinage, sanctioned by both law and custom, provided the framework. Islamic jurisprudence defined enslaved women as the sexual right of their masters. Fatwas issued by scholars stated with precision that ownership equaled access. In principle, masters were cautioned against excessive harm. In practice, restraint was rare. The enslaved woman had no capacity to refuse. Imagine yourself as one of them, taken as a child, perhaps from the Caucasus or the Balkans, sold in a market. Your fate sealed not by your will, but by the coin exchanged for your body. Tonight, you are no longer a daughter or a sister. You are property prepared for use. Archival records describe how such women circulated through the empire's networks of power. Enslaved girls were given to pashas as tokens of favor. They were exchanged between officials to secure loyalty. Even foreign envoys received them as diplomatic offerings. In these transactions, the woman herself disappeared. What remained was a body, an object of utility, a currency of empire. From these coerced unions, children were born. Their status varied. Some were legitimized through forced marriage, a legal fiction masking coercion as choice. Others were branded illegitimate, their mothers discarded into obscurity. Yet these children shaped dynasties, becoming princes, generals, or administrators, living testaments to the empire's foundation in exploitation. The bloodlines of sultans and viziers carried within them the silenced histories of enslaved women. European travelers recorded what they witnessed with unease. Contracts openly listed young women as suitable for concubinage. Markets advertised virginity as a premium attribute. The casual brutality of such language reveals the normalization of sexual slavery, not hidden, not whispered, but inscribed in ink and sealed with signatures. The legal apparatus reinforced it. Courts recognized the master's right, dismissing petitions from enslaved women who resisted. Scholars debated technicalities. Could a child inherit? Did repeated violence breach moral law? The fundamental principle was never questioned. A woman's body was a commodity. Her silence was presumed. The myth of the harem dissolves here. What outsiders imagined as a realm of beauty and pleasure was, in reality, a tightly controlled system of sexual servitude. Behind gilded doors, women were compelled into intimacy, their personal desires erased, their futures dictated by imperial need. For the enslaved woman, there was no refuge. Each glance from her owner might mean summons. Each night carried the weight of violation. Each child born bound her more deeply to the machinery of empire. Generations were shaped by these coercions, generations who carried privilege, while the women who bore them remained voiceless. The empire's silence is telling. Official chronicles omitted their suffering. Registers reduced them to numbers, ages, and origins mere inventory. Yet the fragments that remain travelers' notes, religious rulings, sale contracts all converge on one reality. Sexuality under slavery was not intimacy. It was transaction. And for the enslaved, there was no escape from the cycle. Property could not choose. Property could only be used. This was not love. This was law. This was not privilege. This was power. And this was not hidden. It was systemic. And when bodies broke under this system, the empire had a chillingly efficient way of discarding them. One mistake could cost you your life, your body discarded, forgotten, unnamed. For the enslaved woman in the Ottoman world, survival was never guaranteed. Illness, exhaustion, or the faintest act of resistance could seal her fate. Disease spread swiftly in the confined spaces where women were housed. Cramped quarters meant coughs turned into epidemics, and fevers claimed lives before dawn. When sickness struck, owners faced a calculation. Treatment cost money. Death cost nothing. Many chose the latter. Defiance was punished even more ruthlessly. Administrative records and European travel accounts describe the sanctioned cruelty. A woman who talked back, who refused an order, who attempted escape, her life could be extinguished without hesitation. One method stood out for its chilling precision: drowning. Women were tied in sacks and cast into the waters of the Bosporus. No marker, no name, only silence beneath the current. Imagine that moment, bound, struggling for air, the sack tightening with every desperate movement, the world above vanishing as you sink into the darkness. For the empire, it was not murder. It was disposal. Mass graves testify to this disposability. Archaeological surveys around Istanbul and provincial towns reveal clusters of bodies, buried without ceremony, stripped of identity. Unlike citizens who rested in marked plots, slaves were interred as waste layer upon layer of women whose names were never recorded. The bureaucracy reinforced this cruelty with chilling detachment. In treasury registers, The death of a slave appeared as a line item, a financial loss. Owners sometimes filed for compensation, not in recognition of a human life lost, but for the value of an asset gone. The empire's machinery of record-keeping ensured efficiency, but erased humanity. Foreign observers noted the coldness with horror. Venetian envoys wrote of executions carried out quietly at night, bodies carried through palace gates and thrown into the sea. Yet their outrage did little to change the system. Inside Ottoman society, the practice was neither secret nor scandalous. It was routine. Even the law allowed for it. Islamic legal texts permitted masters to punish their slaves, provided they did not kill without cause. But cause was elastic. Disobedience, suspected theft, or perceived insolence, all could be stretched into justification. In practice, the line between discipline and death blurred until it disappeared. The daily reality for women was one of walking on a knife's edge. You could serve faithfully for years, raise your master's children, or toil from dawn until midnight. But if illness slowed your pace, if fatigue bent your posture, or if despair made you hesitate, the consequence could be fatal. You were never secure. The empire's silence about these deaths speaks volumes. Chronicles celebrated military victories and architectural triumphs. They named viziers, pashas, and sultans, but not the women drowned in sacks, not the bodies in unmarked graves. They were erased from history by design, and yet their absence is evidence. The blank lines in the records, the skeletal remains uncovered by archaeologists, the whispered accounts preserved by foreign visitors, all converge to reveal a system where human lives were treated as temporary, replaceable, disposable. To the master, you were property. To the record keeper, you were inventory. To the empire, you were nothing more than a number. And when that number ceased to serve, it was struck off swiftly, efficiently, without remorse. One mistake, one sickness, one refusal, that was all it took. And yet, for centuries, this cruelty was not condemned, but defended. How do you normalize horror? You give it the language of law and faith. That is how the Ottoman Empire sustained female slavery for centuries, not through secrecy, but through legitimacy. Clerics provided the words. Fatwas issued by respected scholars declared concubinage permissible, so long as ownership existed. The rulings were couched in religious vocabulary, terms of morality, propriety, and divine sanction. To the believer, these words did not sound like cruelty. They sounded like order. Judges provided the enforcement. In courtrooms from Istanbul to Damascus, cases appeared not to question slavery itself, but to regulate it. Who owned whom? Who had the right to punish? Who could claim the children born of forced unions? The institution was never placed on trial. The enslaved woman was never the plaintiff. She was always the property. The treasury provided the incentive. Every sale, every auction, every transfer of human flesh carried a tax. Registers survive with chilling precision, names reduced to origin, age, and price, alongside the fee paid into the state's coffers. To the bureaucracy, the enslaved body was revenue. Loss of life meant loss of income. Profit came first, humanity last. Society, meanwhile, accepted. For households, owning an enslaved servant was as ordinary as owning livestock or tools. No shame, no secrecy, only routine. European travelers consistently remarked on this normalization. What shocked outsiders seemed unremarkable to those within. Dissent existed, but it was muted. A handful of clerics warned against abuse. Some poets whispered of injustice. Yet their voices were drowned by the louder chorus of justification. The empire's machinery of law, religion, and economy ensured silence. Cruelty was not denied. It was sanctified. The system endured into the 19th century, long after many European powers had abolished the trade. But Western pressure mounted. Diplomats raised the issue in treaties. Missionaries documented abuses with relentless persistence. International currents of abolitionism began to erode the empire's defenses. Reform edicts followed. In 1847, decrees targeted the slave trade in Circassian women. Later measures extended to African slavery. By the 1880s, the Ottoman state under external pressure issued abolition orders. Yet even then, enforcement faltered. Practices persisted in private households, hidden from official gaze. Abolition on paper did not instantly erase lives bound in servitude. And so, the system that had been normalized for centuries slowly unraveled, not because the empire itself declared it immoral, but because global currents made it unsustainable. The same clerics who once defended slavery rewrote their words. The same courts that enforced ownership shifted to deny it. What had been law, faith, and economy was suddenly recast as relic. The lesson is haunting. Cruelty does not survive by accident. It survives because it is justified. It survives because authority gives it language. It survives because ordinary people accept that language as truth. You are left to ask, what horrors do we normalize today? What practices are shielded by law, justified by morality, or excused by economics? For the women of the Ottoman Empire, law and faith did not protect. They concealed, they excused, they legitimized. And generations passed, believing the system natural, inevitable, even righteous. And so the question remains, what horrors of today will future generations look back on as normal?